there is an uncomfortable truth that society rarely dares to state outright. The man who frightens the system the most is not the rebel, but the man who does not need to obey in order to live well. He is not poor, not lost, not defiant. Yet he is also not in a hurry to step into marriage as if it were a compulsory duty. And it is precisely this that makes society uneasy. Why does a single self-directed man with inner completeness become a threat? Because he raises a question that many prefer to avoid. Is marriage a free choice, or a stabilizing instrument disguised as love? Machiavelli once pointed out that social order does not survive through coercion, but through people voluntarily accepting the roles assigned to them. When a man refuses that role not out of hatred, but out of lack of necessity, the entire system begins to tremble. This video is not opposed to marriage, nor does it promote isolation. What we are doing here is stripping away the truth behind choices that seem self-evident. Who benefits when you fear being left behind? Who feels secure when you bind yourself? If you have ever felt that you are living according to a pre-written script, stay until the end of this video, because what society fears most may be the very freedom you were never taught to look at directly. There are men who do not unsettle society because they are weak or unsuccessful, but because they cannot be easily read. They do not fall outside the conventional trajectory of life, nor do they live in deprivation or chaos. On the contrary, they stand firm, self-reliant, fully aware of their own capabilities. Yet it is precisely at this seemingly ordinary point that a subtle dissonance appears, one that makes the collective uneasy. They do not enter marriage as an inevitable milestone, not because they are incapable, but because they do not feel compelled. What confuses society is not the state of being single, but the presence of inner calm. A man who does not feel lacking is not easily manipulated by promises of completion, nor easily pressured by the fear of being left behind. When he does not need a role to validate his self-worth, long-standing templates begin to lose their power. Familiar questions, when will you settle down? When will you start a family? Suddenly feel misplaced when faced with a man who stands firmly on his own without needing collective approval. Machiavelli, with his cold and lucid gaze, identified a core truth. Social order is not maintained by constant violence, but by unconscious consent. People accept their roles because they believe those roles are correct, safe, and socially validated. This acceptance is the true foundation of power. Therefore, the greatest threat to any system is not the open rebel, but the one who does not need to comply in order to exist. The man who does not need marriage does not rise up against society, nor does he deny the value of relationships. He simply refuses to let himself be pulled into a framework solely because it is considered normal. And it is precisely this silence that destabilizes order. Because if one person can live meaningfully without completing predefined milestones, it forces others to ask themselves, do the roles they carry truly stem from personal choice, or are they merely the continuation of an outdated script? Machiavelli understood that the strongest form of power is the one that does not need to display itself. Likewise, the deepest form of freedom does not need to be proclaimed. The man who stands outside the script does not do so to prove anything, but because he no longer needs to prove, and it is this inner independence that turns him into a living question for society. Not a question about marriage, but a question about choice. Are we living for what we truly want, or merely fulfilling roles written long before us? In a world where most people are defined by their roles, the existence of a man who does not need a role to feel whole becomes the quietest yet most powerful reminder. Ultimate power does not lie in controlling others, but in refusing to be controlled by collective fear and expectation. If marriage is viewed solely through an emotional lens, it is called love, connection, a home. But Machiavelli, who observed the world through the lens of power and order, would smile at such a naive explanation. To him, any social institution that has endured for centuries does not rest on emotion alone, but on its function of control. And marriage, from this perspective, is one of the most sophisticated stabilizing mechanisms society has ever created. When a man enters marriage, he does not merely bind himself to another person. He steps into a dense web of responsibilities, financial obligations, moral duties, family expectations, reputational pressure. These threads do not cause pain immediately, but they are tight enough to restrict movement. A man with a family will think twice before taking risks. A man with children will carefully weigh every decision that involves changing direction. And a man labeled a provider will regulate his behavior so as not to disturb the image society has bestowed upon him. Machiavelli understood this nature clearly. The most effective power does not need to repress. It only needs to create conditions that make people unwilling to leave order behind. A man bound by long-term debt, by the duty of provision, by the judging gaze of the community, becomes automatically more predictable. He does not need to be guarded, because responsibility itself has become the sentry in his mind. What is most notable is that this process unfolds in silence. No one is forced into marriage by violence. Instead, society plants a belief in the human mind. Stability is maturity. Attachment is correctness. Sacrifice is noble. Once these beliefs are accepted, binding no longer appears as a loss of freedom, but is disguised as the destination of happiness. This is precisely the subtlety Machiavelli implicitly pointed to. The most enduring order is the one its participants voluntarily defend. From this perspective, marriage is not a bad thing, but it is by no means neutral. It softens uncertainty, reduces the likelihood of rebellion, and channels the wild energy of the individual into behaviors that can be anticipated. A society filled with men who carry family responsibilities is a society that is less volatile, less risky, and therefore easier to manage. But Machiavelli would also pose a cold-cutting question. Does that stability arise from free choice or from fear of loss? When a man stays because of love, that is strength. But when he stays because he fears losing his position, reputation, or security, that is power at work. Understanding this is not meant to dismantle marriage, but to make each individual fully aware of one thing: why they are bound. Because only by confronting the true nature of constraint can stability become a conscious choice, rather than a cage adorned with elegant words. Freedom has always been the element that places every system under strain. Not because freedom causes immediate chaos, but because it cannot be predicted. The man who does not need marriage is often misunderstood as someone who avoids responsibility or rejects connection, but the truth is far deeper. He does not place his identity inside a relationship. He does not need to be reflected in another's gaze to know who he is. And it is precisely this that unsettles social order. A person who defines himself through roles, husband, provider, guarantor, is a person who has placed himself on a familiar map. The system knows where he is going, and what he needs to continue functioning. But a man who does not make marriage the pillar of his identity is different. He retains the ability to leave when the path is no longer right. He can refuse arrangements that do not fit. And, most importantly, he can restructure his life without asking permission from anyone. Machiavelli, in his renowned severity, understood that effective power does not lie in coercive force, but in dependency. A system runs smoothly when people need it to survive for safety, reputation, status, meaning. At that point, control becomes gentle, almost invisible. But the man who does not need marriage inadvertently breaks this logic. He does not need the system to validate his worth. and therefore the system can no longer retain its central position. What makes freedom the most difficult thing to manage is not that it provokes resistance, but that it opens the possibility of choice. Someone who can choose to leave will always make order uneasy, not because he will leave, but because he can. Power does not fear temporary rebellion. It fears sustained independence. A rebel is still bound to the system he opposes. An independent individual is not. The man who does not need marriage does not stand outside society to reject it. He still loves, still connects, still has the capacity for deep attachment. But that attachment comes from choice, not from the need to survive. He stays because he wants to, not because there is no way back. And this fragile distinction creates a reversal of power. From a system that must be relied upon, it becomes an option that can be accepted or declined. Machiavelli would call this individual difficult to govern, not because he is dangerous, but because he cannot be held in place by fear. When a man does not fear solitude, does not fear losing a role, does not fear starting over, he enters a state of freedom that very few social structures can control. And at that point, freedom ceases to be a romantic concept and becomes a silent force, the kind of force that compels every system to adapt, or to accept that not everyone needs to exist within a pre-written script. Every enduring society is built upon a foundational belief, one that is rarely spoken aloud, that human beings are not enough, not wise enough, not mature enough, not worthy enough to stand alone. From this sense of insufficiency, norms are formed, milestones are erected, and correct paths are drawn in advance. Men are taught that they are only truly complete when they attach themselves to something larger than themselves, the husband, the provider, the guarantor of another's future. But Machiavelli, who always looked beyond moral appearances to underlying motives, understood that the feeling of being not enough is not merely a personal psychological issue. It is the ideal condition for power to operate. A person who believes he lacks will always seek compensation from the outside titles, recognition, social roles, and in that search he becomes easier to guide, easier to persuade, easier to place into predesigned molds. By contrast, a man who has gone deeply enough into his own inner world creates a dangerous paradox for every form of control. When he has learned to be alone without panic, to understand his emotions without concealment, to cultivate discipline without supervision, and to accept both instinct and reason within himself, he can no longer be driven by the fear of lack. He does not need to prove who he is, because he already knows who he is. Inner completeness does not make a person detached or cold. It makes him difficult to manipulate. Promises of status, warnings about being left behind, or standards repeated as eternal truths begin to lose their grip. When a man no longer seeks his value in the eyes of others, power loses its most effective instrument, insecurity. Machiavelli would not label such a man rebellious or defiant. He would call him hard to rule, not because he resists laws, but because he does not depend on the psychological mechanisms upon which those laws rely to endure. An individual who does not fear exclusion, does not fear losing a title, does not fear beginning again, is one whom the system cannot easily coerce. What is most striking is that this completeness does not come from accumulating more roles, but from stripping away illusions of insufficiency. When a man realizes that his worth is not determined by which milestones he has achieved, society is forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Not everyone needs to be completed by the system, and in that moment, power no longer rests entirely in the hands of collective norms. It begins to shift inward, into the individual, where control is at its most fragile. If politics requires stability to maintain power, then economics requires a sense of lack in order to keep functioning. Machiavelli observed that human beings are most easily guided when they believe they are not enough, not strong enough, not safe enough, not worthy enough. In the modern world, this belief no longer serves political power alone. It has become the fuel for an enormous economic machine. And at the center of that machine stands the image of the man who needs marriage. When a man believes that his value is tied to the role of husband, provider, pillar of the family, he enters a nearly automatic cycle of consumption. The house must be bigger to be worthy. Spending must increase to prove his ability to provide. Long-term loans and successive financial obligations cease to be merely personal choices and gradually become expected norms. In this cycle, consumption no longer arises from genuine desire, but from the need to affirm one's position in the eyes of society. Machiavelli would view this phenomenon as a refined form of power. No coercion required, only invisible pressure. A man burdened with the need to prove his worth will voluntarily work more, consume more, and accept long-term commitments without being ordered to do so. He believes he is building happiness, but in reality, he is serving a system that survives on human insecurity. The problem emerges when a man steps outside this logic, when he no longer buys to impress, no longer lives to attain the title of ideal husband, and no longer spends to fill a pre-installed sense of lack. He withdraws from a familiar operational chain. No longer consuming to prove, he begins to consume consciously. No longer chasing images, he returns to real needs. And in that very moment, he becomes a threat not to social morality, but to an economy built upon emotional scarcity. A man who does not need marriage to feel complete will not be easily manipulated by advertising, norms, or promises of a proper life. He questions every choice. Do I truly want this, or am I trying to prove something? To Machiavelli, this is the mark of an individual who has begun to wield power over himself, and such power always destabilizes systems that depend on dependency. What is notable is that this withdrawal is not loud. This man does not call for boycotts, does not oppose the market. He simply stops playing a role. Yet, if a sufficient number of such men appear, the entire system is forced to confront an uncomfortable question. If people consumed only based on real value, rather than fear of judgment, how many industries would lose their reason to exist? Machiavelli understood that the strongest form of power is the one that makes people act without realizing they are being guided. And therefore, the greatest threat does not come from poverty or rebellion, but from a man who is inwardly complete, who no longer buys to prove, no longer lives to meet expectations, and no longer needs the system to feel valuable. Machiavelli never placed faith in the image of human purity, as moral sermons often portray it. He did not deny goodness, but he understood clearly that human beings do not operate on ideals, but on instinct, interest, and fear. For Machiavelli, true strength does not come from seeing oneself as good, but from looking directly at one's true nature. And it is precisely at this point that the man who does not need marriage begins to diverge. This man does not live under the illusion that he is more virtuous than others. He has confronted the parts society often advises us to hide: selfishness, the desire for absolute freedom, and the truth that he is not always willing to sacrifice himself for others. Instead of denying these aspects, he acknowledges them. Instead of feeling ashamed, he observes them, and instead of allowing them to unconsciously control him, he manages them with awareness. Machiavelli would regard this as the sign of a person mature in inner power. For the most dangerous individual is not the one who has a dark side, but the one who does not know he has one. When people believe they are purely good, they easily become hypocritical, easily provoked, and easily manipulated by appeals framed in terms of right and wrong. By contrast, the man who understands his own darkness does not need to perform morality to be accepted. He does not need to prove that he is self-sacrificing, noble, or admirable. This ruthless honesty with oneself creates a rare form of freedom. When he admits that he loves freedom, he no longer needs to justify his choices with moral excuses. When he understands his own selfishness, he does not allow it to erupt in unconscious behaviors or distorted relationships. He knows he is capable of hardness, and therefore he chooses when to be gentle. This is not emotional coldness, but self-mastery, something Machiavelli always regarded as the foundation of all lasting power. In a society that glorifies the image of the good person, this man is easily misunderstood. He does not flaunt sacrifice, does not perform morality, does not place himself on a moral pedestal, but precisely because of that, he is not bound by the pressure to maintain an image. He does not need marriage to prove that he is trustworthy, nor does he need a social role to validate his moral worth. Machiavelli understood that the easiest people to govern are those who need to be seen as good. For when moral reputation becomes an asset, it also becomes a vulnerability. The man who knows his own dark side is different. He does not fear being exposed, because he has never hidden it. And this is precisely what makes him more solid than any moral facade. Ultimately, the maturity Machiavelli implicitly pointed to does not lie in becoming a perfect human being, but in becoming an awake one. The man who does not need marriage, having understood his own darkness, no longer lives to be accepted. He lives to master himself. And in the realm of power, nothing is more formidable than a person who no longer has to play a role. The greatest problem of marriage has never been whether people enter it or not, but the motive behind that decision. Machiavelli, who always examined power through the lens of choice and interest, would not ask a man whether he is married. He would ask whether the man chose from a state of freedom or from a state of dependence. For it is precisely at this point that the boundary between strength and reliance truly reveals itself. When a man marries out of need, he is seeking compensation. He needs recognition, needs a sense of security, needs a role in order to feel that he has arrived. In this case, marriage is no longer the meeting of two free individuals, but becomes a psychological anchor, and anything chosen for the sake of survival carries with it a fear of loss. That fear quietly shapes behavior, making people more willing to compromise, more willing to trade away parts of themselves, and more willing to accept things they would never choose if they were firmly grounded within themselves. By contrast, when a man marries because he wants to, the entire structure of power shifts. He does not enter a relationship to fill a void, but to share a life that is already whole. Attachment then arises not from fear, but from will. And it is precisely this subtle difference that creates strength. Machiavelli understood that true strength does not come from obeying rules, but from the ability to choose rules when necessary. The man who moves from dependence to choice is a man who has escaped the logic of having to. He does not oppose marriage, nor does he deny the value of commitment. What he refuses is turning marriage into a compulsory obligation, a moral test, or a measure of human worth. For when a choice is transformed into a duty, it is no longer a choice, it becomes submission. Machiavelli implicitly pointed out that the easiest individuals to govern are those who believe they have no choice. They comply not because they agree, but because they see no alternative. By contrast, a man who is aware of his power to choose always retains an active position, even when he decides to commit for the long term. He stays not out of fear, but because he wants to stay. And only then does commitment carry real value. This is where the motivational core lies. Freedom does not equal isolation, and commitment does not equal loss of power. The issue lies in who holds the power of decision. When a man realizes that he can live well without following a predefined script, every choice that follows, including marriage, becomes clearer. He no longer seeks validation from society, but defines for himself what is right for who he is. Ultimately, Machiavelli would not praise a man for being single or married. He would look at how the man chooses. For in the world of power and human nature, the strong are not those who say yes to every norm, but those who know when to agree and when to refuse. And from the moment a man lives by choice rather than necessity, he steps into a level of freedom that no system can easily strip away. It is not the loud ones who make society uneasy. History shows that what power systems fear most is not open resistance, but unpredictability. A man who can be alone without collapsing, who does not need applause to exist, who does not need a social role to feel valuable, such a man steps outside every familiar map that order has drawn in advance. And precisely because he is not on the map, he becomes an unknown variable. Society operates on its ability to predict people. When it knows what someone fears, needs, and wants, the system can guide them without coercion. But a man who does not fear solitude is difficult to threaten. A man who does not fear judgment is difficult to behaviorally adjust. And a man who does not need titles to feel complete is difficult to buy off with status. These traits may appear personal and quiet, but through Machiavelli's lens, they are signs of an individual who is hard to control. Machiavelli warned that individuals who do not depend on the existing order always carry within them the potential to alter the balance, even without any ambition to overthrow it. For their very existence poses a dangerous question. If we do not need these things, why do we believe we do? When someone lives well without relying on templates, the templates themselves begin to be questioned. And for power, nothing is more frightening than the spread of silent doubt. The unpredictable man is not necessarily a rebel. He may be calm, orderly, even courteous, but he preserves an inner distance, a space that collective expectations cannot reach. He can stay or leave without explanation. He can accept or refuse without guilt. And it is precisely this capacity that leaves society unsure of where to place him. In Machiavelli's world, the strongest power is the power that knows the opponent's next move. But the man who does not need roles in order to exist does not follow established paths. He does not act to impress, nor react to oppose. He acts from self-understanding. This renders every attempt to label, categorize, or predict him fragile. The unease he creates does not come from action, but from the possibility of choice. When a man demonstrates that life still has meaning, even without following the shared script, he says nothing aloud, yet his existence speaks for itself. It forces others to ask, are the roles we carry truly choices, or merely habits repeated long enough to be considered right? Machiavelli understood that order does not collapse from frontal blows, but from individuals who no longer believe that order is irreplaceable. The unpredictable man embodies that possibility. He does not need to break society. Simply living a little differently is enough to make the foundations of control begin to tremble. The man who does not need marriage does not come to persuade you to live like him. He does not preach, propose a new template, or promise a more righteous path. The only thing he does, and the thing society finds most uncomfortable, is ask a question. A simple question, yet deep enough to shake even the most certain choices. Are you living by your own will, or are you completing a script written in advance by a system of stability? That question does not target marriage alone, but the entire way people make decisions. For many choices in life are born not from genuine desire, but from fear of falling behind, fear of judgment, fear of being seen as abnormal. When a man marries out of fear of loneliness, fear of social scrutiny, fear of not having arrived, he does not enter marriage, he enters a mechanism of self-control. He binds himself with commitments that deep down he never chose in a state of freedom. But Machiavelli would not condemn this in moral language. He would look directly at interests. For him, the question is not right or wrong, noble or selfish, but who benefits from this choice? When a man chooses marriage from fear, the system benefits. Society gains another stable, predictable, adjustable individual. The economy gains another long-term committed consumer. Norms are reinforced, order preserved. But what about the individual himself? Did he truly choose, or did he merely adapt? By contrast, when marriage is chosen from inner strength, everything changes. A man who is complete within himself does not enter a relationship to be saved, but to build together. He does not fear being alone, and therefore does not cling. He does not fear judgment, and therefore does not trade himself away to be accepted. And thus, if he chooses marriage, it is a beautiful choice not because it makes him correct, but because it fits the man he has become. Machiavelli would call this the difference between one who is guided and one who is self-directed. A choice born of strength always retains the right to leave, the right to adjust, the right to say no when necessary. A choice born of fear always carries dependence, no matter how elegantly it is wrapped. And that is why the man who does not need marriage becomes an uncomfortable mirror. Not because he is more right, but because he forces others to ask, not, should I get married or not, but am I choosing this because I want to, or because I fear what I will lose if I do not? Machiavelli's final question is not meant to dismantle relationships, but to return power to the individual. For when you clearly understand who benefits from your choices, you begin to live more consciously. And if you are still thinking at this point, it means the question has touched you, not the question of whether you should marry or not, but whether you are choosing from strength or from fear. Machiavelli once reminded us that the greatest power does not lie in controlling others, but in refusing to be controlled by invisible patterns. The man who does not need marriage is neither right nor wrong. He simply forces us to look back at ourselves. If this video made you think differently, press like to support the channel, subscribe to continue exploring deep perspectives on power and the human mind, and leave a comment below. Are you living by your own choices or by society's script? Let's discuss.